The lecture hall at Westwood University buzzed with the low hum of students settling into their seats, flipping through worn-out notebooks and unlocking their laptops. It was just another Tuesday morning in Professor Evelyn Harding's advanced calculus class, a course infamous for its brutal difficulty, and for Harding's even tougher teaching style. She didn't just teach mathematics, she commanded it. With sharp features, silver-rimmed glasses, and an unshakable gaze, she could make even the most confident students hesitate. Precision and discipline weren't just expectations in her class, they were requirements. If you wanted to pass, you had to earn it. No shortcuts, no sympathy. Harding strode to the front, heels clicking against the tiled floor, and in one swift motion, snapped a piece of chalk between her fingers. The room fell silent. Last lecture, we covered multivariable limits. Today, we push forward. Laplace transforms. She turned to the board and began writing, her strokes clean and precise, filling the surface with intricate equations. Students scrambled to take notes, some already lost in the symbols, others nodding as if they understood. Harding thrived on this, the struggle, the pressure, the silent competition. It reinforced her belief that only the truly exceptional belonged in her world. Somewhere near the middle of the hall, Nathan Hale, a tall, lean junior in a hoodie and jeans, tapped his pen against his notebook. Unlike the others, he wasn't panicking. He wasn't even engaged. If anything, he looked bored. Numbers, patterns, equations. They just made sense to him in a way they didn't for others. His eyes scanned the board. Something was off. A tiny mistake, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. Nathan hesitated. He could let it go. No one else seemed to notice. But Harding was meticulous, and if she caught it later, she'd double back, wasting time correcting it. Before he could decide, a girl in the front row hesitantly raised her hand. "Professor Harding, I think there's an error in the second line." Harding turned slowly, arching a brow. An error? As if the very idea was offensive. She scanned the board, then smirked. "There is no error." The girl's face reddened as she quickly looked down. Nathan exhaled, shaking his head. He hated this. The way some professors dismissed students, the way they acted as if they were beyond making mistakes. Before he could stop himself, his hand was in the air. "Actually," he said, voice calm, "there is an error." A ripple went through the room. Heads turned. Harding's expression remained unchanged, but for the briefest second, there was a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Oh?" She crossed her arms. "Enlighten me." Nathan stood, not out of arrogance, not to make a spectacle of it. He just preferred to speak from a position of confidence. "It's in the second step. You applied the transformation to the wrong term," he said, pointing at the board. "The coefficient doesn't carry over that way. If you solve it using your method, the final answer won't match the expected result." Silence. Harding's jaw tensed. She turned back to the board, scanning her own work. Then there it was. The mistake. For a moment, Nathan thought she might admit it and move on. Instead, her lips curled into a tight smile. "Well, Mr. Hale," she said, turning to face him, "since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way?" A few students chuckled under their breath. Nathan could hear the unspoken message behind her words. She didn't want to acknowledge that he was right. She wanted to put him on the spot, make him hesitate, make him stumble. But that wasn't going to happen. Nathan set his notebook down and walked to the front of the room, unfazed by the expectant silence. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He just hated errors, especially ones that could have been avoided. Harding extended the chalk with a slight smirk, a challenge hidden behind her expression. Nathan took it without hesitation. With smooth, deliberate strokes, he erased the incorrect part of the equation and rewrote it. His handwriting wasn't as polished as Harding's, but that didn't matter. The numbers did, and they lined up perfectly. "The mistake was in how the transform was applied," he explained as he worked. "You carried the coefficient outside too early, which changed the integral limits. If you solve it this way, the function stays intact." The only sound in the room was the quiet scratch of chalk against the board. He finished, set the chalk down, and turned back toward the class. Professor Harding stood motionless, arms crossed. She wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in front of a lecture hall full of students. Nathan could see it in her eyes. She wanted to dismiss him, brush it off, maybe even twist the situation, so she still looked right. Instead, she took a slow breath and nodded curtly. "Fine," she said. "You corrected it. Congratulations." A few students exchanged glances. That was it? No acknowledgement? No real praise? Nathan didn't need it. He simply returned to his seat, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes still on him. Some looked impressed. A few seemed annoyed, probably the ones who thought he was showing off. But he wasn't. He had just spoken up when no one else would. Harding turned back to the board, erasing his work with brisk, almost impatient motions. "Let's move on," she said. Then without warning, she paused and glanced back at him. "Since Mr. Hale is so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge." Nathan blinked. "Excuse me?" Harding was already writing again. This time the equations sprawled across half the board, dense with integrals, limits, and a particularly tricky differential component. A few students shifted in their seats. Nathan knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't a normal problem, not for this level. The complexity alone made it clear. She didn't expect him to get it right. She expected him to hesitate, stumble over the steps, maybe get partway through before realizing he was in over his head. She wanted to prove a point. Nathan exhaled through his nose. "Fine." He stood again and walked back to the board. A few students chuckled, clearly expecting him to struggle. Harding smirked, stepping back and folding her arms. "Take your time." Nathan didn't need time. He picked up the chalk and started writing, his movements precise, his focus unwavering. He wasn't just solving, he was seeing the entire solution unfold before his hand had even reached the board. He didn't pause to think. He was already 5 steps ahead. The room grew quieter. The murmurs stopped. Harding's smirk faded. Halfway through the equation, Nathan glanced at her. "I assume you want the solution in terms of exponentials instead of trigonometric functions?" She didn't answer. He kept going. A few more steps, a few simplifications, then done. He underlined the final answer and turned around, casually setting the chalk back on the tray. Silence. A single student let out a low whistle from the back. Harding's expression was unreadable. She scanned his work line by line, searching for an error, anything she could use to dismiss it. There was nothing. He hadn't just solved it correctly, he had solved it elegantly. A few students started whispering. Others leaned forward, realizing what had just happened. Nathan crossed his arms, not smiling, not gloating, just waiting. Harding finally spoke, her voice tight. "Lucky guess." A few students laughed, though not at Nathan. He tilted his head slightly. "It wasn't a guess." Harding exhaled sharply through her nose. "Sit down, Mr. Hale." Nathan turned and walked back to his seat. He could feel the shift in the room, the way people were looking at him now. Some with admiration, some with resentment, and one person, Professor Harding, with something else entirely. But she wasn't done with him yet. The energy in the room had changed. Nathan could feel it. No one was looking at Professor Harding the same way they had at the start of class. He hadn't set out to embarrass her. That wasn't his goal. But he also wasn't going to shrink himself just to make her comfortable. Harding turned back to the board, gripping the chalk a little tighter. She continued with the lecture, but the sharpness in her tone was gone, replaced by something more controlled, more measured. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-sentence. She turned to the class, scanning the rows of students before locking eyes with Nathan. "If you're so confident, Mr. Hale," she said, forcing a smile, "how about we raise the stakes?" A few students chuckled. Others leaned forward, sensing something was about to go down. Nathan didn't react. "What do you mean?" Harding walked over to her desk, pulled out a thick textbook, and flipped through the pages. She stopped on a section deep inside the book, far beyond what they had covered in class. Then she turned it around, making sure the entire class could see the dense equations on the page. "This," she said, tapping a particularly intimidating problem, "is from an advanced graduate level course, something I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to be able to solve." A murmur rippled through the room. "But," she continued, her smile tight, "since you seem to have a natural talent for this, why don't you prove it?" Nathan exhaled slowly. He could see exactly what she was doing. This wasn't about math anymore. She wasn't just testing his skills. She was testing his ability to handle pressure. She wanted to push him past his limit, to make him struggle in front of everyone. Maybe he'd get partway through the problem, hesitate, and then she'd step in, taking back control of the room. She'd remind everyone why she was the authority here. Nathan could refuse. He didn't owe her this. But the way the students were watching him, the way some were waiting for him to back down, made his decision for him. He stood up. Harding's smirk wavered, just for a second. Nathan walked to the front of the room. She handed him the textbook, but he didn't even look at it. He had already memorized the problem. Without a word, he picked up the chalk. He knew this trick. She had pulled it before, choosing a problem just out of reach to humble students who thought too highly of themselves. But she had miscalculated. Nathan lived for problems like this. He started writing, his movements smooth, deliberate. The problem was tough, no doubt about it. But tough didn't mean impossible. As he worked, the whispers in the room faded. The only sound was the chalk gliding across the board. He didn't rush. Every step unfolded naturally, flowing from one equation to the next. Every simplification, every transformation. It was all leading to the inevitable answer. And then finally he boxed the final result. He turned back to the class. Silence. Professor Harding's face was unreadable, but her clenched jaw and the stiff way she held herself said enough. She had expected this to put him in his place. Instead, he had just made her look like a fool. A student in the back let out a low laugh. Yo, what even? Even the students who had been skeptical were now staring at Nathan differently. Harding's hand twitched at her side. She had to say something, had to take back control of the room. You've skipped a step, she said, her voice clipped. Nathan raised an eyebrow. No, I didn't. Her fingers curled slightly. Yes, you did. Nathan turned back to the board, scanning his work. Then, without missing a beat, he pointed to a section near the middle. This step here, where I simplified the partial fraction decomposition, that's what you're talking about. Harding didn't answer. Nathan nodded. I didn't skip it. I just did the calculation mentally because it was straightforward. The class was dead silent. Harding's face tightened. Nathan turned back to her. But if you'd like, I can write it out. The way he said it, it wasn't cocky. It wasn't even challenging. It was just matter of fact. And that made it worse. He wasn't trying to make her look bad. She was doing that to herself. Harding inhaled sharply. Number that won't be necessary. She turned back to her desk and set the textbook down. A little harder than necessary. Nathan could feel it. He had just turned the class against her. But Harding wasn't going to let this end here. Professor Harding turned back to the class, her face composed, but her grip on the desk betrayed her frustration. Nathan sat down, but he knew this wasn't over. The students were still digesting what had just happened. Some exchanging glances, others whispering in low voices. Then from the second row, a hand shot up. Professor, a student said. It was Brian, one of Harding's favorites. He leaned forward. If he got it right, doesn't that mean Nathan just solved a graduate-level problem? Shouldn't that, mean something? Harding's lips pressed into a thin line. Brian wasn't wrong, but acknowledging it would mean admitting that she had underestimated Nathan. I never said it was impossible, she responded smoothly. Only that it would be difficult for an undergraduate. There was something calculated about the way she said it, like she was already trying to rewrite what had happened. Another student raised their hand. So if he got it right, does that mean he should be in a more advanced class? Harding didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at Nathan. There was something different in her eyes now. Not just frustration, but calculation. Then finally she smiled. I think, she said, her voice softer, Mr. Hale would benefit from an academic challenge. A few students perked up. Was she actually recognizing his talent? Was she about to suggest a higher-level placement? Nathan wasn't convinced, which is why Harding continued. I'd like to invite him to a little competition. Murmurs spread across the room. Nathan frowned. What kind of competition? Harding walked to her desk and pulled out a folder. She flipped it open, scanning the papers inside. There's a university-sponsored mathematics symposium coming up next month, she said. Some of the best students from different schools in the region will be competing. It's a rigorous, high-pressure environment, not just about solving problems, but doing it under time constraints. With an audience. She looked up, locking eyes with him. I assume you'd be up for it. Nathan immediately understood what she was doing. This wasn't an opportunity. This was a setup. She wasn't just testing his math skills anymore. She was testing his ability to perform under pressure. If he failed, it wouldn't just be in front of his classmates. It would be in front of professors, graduate students, and some of the best mathematical minds in the field. She wanted to see if he'd crack. Nathan could feel the weight of the room. People were waiting for his answer. If he backed down now, it would look like he had gotten lucky today, that he wasn't actually as capable as he seemed. And if he accepted, he'd have to win. Nathan exhaled, then nodded once. I'm in. Harding's smile didn't reach her eyes. Excellent. But she wasn't finished with him yet. The news spread fast. By the time Nathan stepped out of the lecture hall, students were already whispering about it in the hallways. Some nodded at him with newfound respect. Others looked at him the way people look at an athlete before a championship game, curious, expectant, waiting to see if he'd live up to the hype. Nathan barely paid attention. He had bigger things to focus on. The symposium was in 4 weeks. That meant he had 4 weeks to prepare for a competition that people spent months, sometimes years, training for. That night, he sat in the campus library, surrounded by textbooks, notebooks filled with calculations, and a half-empty coffee cup that had long gone cold. He had always loved math, but this was different. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was personal. Burning the midnight oil already? Nathan looked up to see Brian standing by his table, hands in his pockets. He shrugged. Gotta be ready. Brian smirked, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. Dude, you're already ahead of half the people who compete in these things. Harding's just pissed that you embarrassed her. That's the only reason she threw you into this. Nathan leaned back in his chair. I know. Brian studied him for a second. So why do it? Nathan thought about that for a moment. He had asked himself the same thing more than once. He didn't need to prove anything. He could have walked away, let the moment pass. But he also knew how people like Harding operated. If he backed down, she'd use it as confirmation. She'd find a way to frame it, say that he was talented but not disciplined enough, intelligent but not ready for real challenges. She would make sure that's what people remembered. Nathan wasn't going to let that happen. Because she expects me to lose, he finally said, and I want her to be wrong. Brian grinned. Now that I can respect. 4 weeks later, Nathan stood in a large auditorium-style lecture hall at Creswell University, staring at the panel of judges and the long digital timer displayed above the stage. Competitors sat in assigned seats, their desks filled with scratch paper, pens, and one simple directive: solve the problems faster and more accurately than everyone else. Professor Harding was in the audience. She hadn't spoken to him much leading up to this. No encouragement, no advice. Just a polite nod when they arrived, as if she were a mere observer instead of the person who had thrown him into this. Nathan knew what she was waiting for. She wanted to see if he'd crack. The timer started. He didn't. The first round was mental math, solving problems without writing anything down. While some competitors hesitated, Nathan's hands moved without pause, punching numbers into the response system faster than the proctors could verify them. The second round was theoretical application, breaking down complex concepts into proofs. Here, his natural intuition took over. Numbers weren't just numbers to him. They were patterns. They were rhythms. They were structures that built upon one another. The third round was speed solving. This was where most people tripped up. Pressure could make even the best students second-guess themselves. Nathan thrived under pressure. He kept going, ignoring the murmurs as his name climbed higher and higher on the leaderboard. By the final round, there were only 2 competitors left in serious contention: Nathan and a PhD candidate from MIT. The last problem appeared on the screen. It was brutal, layers of integrals nested within summations, a problem designed to test not just knowledge, but endurance. Nathan's pulse steadied. He exhaled. picked up his pen, and started writing. The clock ticked down, each second stretching like an eternity. Nathan's fingers gripped his pen, his mind slicing through the problem like a scalpel. Every layer of the equation had to be perfect. No shortcuts, no miscalculations. He could hear the faint scribbling of his competitor beside him, the MIT PhD candidate, a student who had spent years mastering this level of mathematics. They were neck and neck, each racing to finish first. Nathan's heart pounded, but his thoughts were clear. He saw the pattern, the shortcut no one else would see. That was it. His hand moved faster, slashing through the numbers, simplifying expressions in ways most students wouldn't even think of. He didn't need to double-check. He knew. Final answer. He boxed it and set his pen down. The timer buzzed. Nathan looked up, breathing steady. His competitor was still writing. The room was dead silent. One of the judges stood, walking over to examine both answers. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. A long pause. Then the judge raised his microphone. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Nathan Hale. The room erupted. Some students clapped. Others let out audible gasps. Nathan didn't react right away. He just exhaled, letting the reality of it sink in. He had won, not just against the other students, but against the expectations placed on him, against the professor who had doubted him, against the unspoken assumptions that had tried to define him before he had the chance to define himself. Professor Harding was motionless in the crowd. Nathan met her gaze for the first time. She looked unsure, like she was reassessing everything she thought she knew. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't scowling either. And then after a long moment, she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Nathan didn't need an apology. He didn't need validation. He had let the numbers speak for themselves. The next morning, Nathan walked into class, taking his usual seat. The room felt different. Students who had barely noticed him before now watched him with curiosity, respect, maybe even a little intimidation. Brian smirked from across the aisle, giving him a knowing nod. Then the door opened. Professor Harding entered, just as composed as always. She set her materials down at the front of the room, adjusting her glasses. Then she scanned the class. Her gaze landed on Nathan, and this time there was something different in her eyes. Respect. She cleared her throat. Before we begin today's lecture, she said, her tone as even as ever, I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium. The room fell quiet. Nathan Hale took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country. She continued, that is no small achievement. A few students clapped. Brian grinned, nudging Nathan's arm. Harding turned back to the board. And with that said, she continued, let's begin. That was it. No over-the-top praise, no long speech, just acknowledgement. And somehow that meant more than anything else, because Nathan hadn't needed to prove himself to her. He had needed to prove something to himself, and he had. Because sometimes the best way to change people's minds isn't through words, it's through undeniable truth. That night, Nathan sat alone in the campus library, a half-empty coffee cup beside him, and pages of calculations sprawled across the table. The glow of a desk lamp cast long shadows over his notes, formulas, and proofs, filling every available inch of paper. The symposium was 4 weeks away. 4 weeks to prepare for a competition that students spent years training for. He tapped his pen against the table, eyes scanning the equations. He didn't just need to solve problems. He needed to anticipate them, to recognize patterns before they even appeared, to make his thinking faster, sharper. But this wasn't just about math anymore. This was personal. Burning the midnight oil already? Nathan looked up. Brian stood across from him, hands in his pockets, an amused smirk on his face. He shrugged. Gotta be ready. Brian pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Dude, you're already ahead of half the people who compete in these things. Harding's just pissed that you embarrassed her. That's the only reason she threw you into this. Nathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. I know, Brian studied him for a moment. So why do it? Nathan had asked himself the same thing more than once. He didn't need to prove anything. He could have walked away, let the moment pass, but he knew how people like Harding operated. If he backed down, she'd rewrite the story. She'd say he was talented but not disciplined, that he was intelligent but not ready for real challenges. She would control the narrative. Nathan wasn't going to let that happen. "Because she expects me to lose," he finally said. Brian raised an eyebrow. Nathan exhaled, glancing down at his notes. "And I want her to be wrong." A slow grin spread across Brian's face. "Now that I can respect—" He leaned back, stretching his arms. "All right then, genius. If you're going to do this, let's do it right. You're not training alone." Nathan smirked. "Oh? You suddenly care about math?" Brian laughed. "No, but I love watching people prove others wrong. And besides, you're going to need someone to time you when you start speed solving." Nathan nodded. 4 weeks. 4 weeks to sharpen his mind. 4 weeks to prove he belonged, and he wasn't about to waste a single second. 4 weeks later, Nathan sat in the auditorium at Creswell University, his fingers lightly tapping against the desk. Around him, competitors whispered among themselves, glancing at the massive digital timer mounted above the stage. The tension in the air was palpable. This was it, the University Mathematics Symposium, a competition that drew some of the most brilliant minds from top-tier schools across the country. Nathan had prepared for this moment, but now that he was here, staring at the panel of judges, the reality of it sank in. This wasn't a classroom. This wasn't some lecture where a professor tried to put him in his place. This was the real thing. Nathan took a slow breath. He thrived under pressure. He had to remind himself of that. Across the room, Professor Harding sat in the audience, her expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken much to him since arriving. No encouragement, no advice, just a polite nod, like she was nothing more than an observer. But Nathan knew better. She was waiting to see if he would crack. The first round began, the mental math round. No paper, no calculators, just a rapid-fire test of pure numerical intuition. A series of complex calculations flashed on the screen, and competitors had seconds to input their answers. Nathan's hands moved without hesitation, punching numbers into the response system. The proctors barely had time to verify them before he moved to the next, one after another. No second guessing, no hesitation. The leaderboard updated in real time. Nathan's name climbed, higher, higher. By the end of the first round, he was in the top 3. Harding remained expressionless. The theoretical application round. Prove theorems. Break down complex concepts. Construct airtight logical arguments. This was where most students slowed down. Nathan didn't. To him, numbers weren't just numbers. They were patterns. They were rhythms. They were structures waiting to be decoded. His pen flew across the page, his proofs flowing seamlessly. Minutes passed like seconds. The leaderboard refreshed. Nathan had moved to second place. The competitor ahead of him, a PhD student from MIT, the speed-solving round. This was where the pressure cracked even the best competitors. 30 minutes, 3 problems, each one designed to be so difficult, most people wouldn't even finish one. Nathan steadied his breathing. The first problem flashed on the screen. His pen hit the paper. Every step was calculated, precise, efficient. Other students paused, rechecking their work. Nathan didn't. He knew he was right. First problem, solved. He glanced at the clock. He was ahead of pace. The second problem, even harder, integrals nested within summations. Nathan's mind broke it apart instantly. He slashed through the calculations, seeing the solution before he even finished writing it down. Second problem, solved. The MIT PhD student was right behind him. Nathan didn't look up. One more. The final problem flashed on the screen. It was brutal. It was designed to test not just knowledge, but endurance. Layers upon layers of transformations. Nathan's pulse steadied. He could see the shortcut, the hidden path through the chaos. He exhaled, picked up his pen, and started writing. The timer buzzed. Nathan dropped his pen, his fingers tense from the rapid movements. His competitor was still writing. A deep silence filled the room. The judges stood, walking over to examine the answers. The entire auditorium waited. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then finally, the head judge raised his microphone. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Nathan Hale. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the room erupted. Some students clapped. Others let out audible gasps. Nathan sat back in his chair, letting the moment wash over him. He had done it. Not just against the other students, not just against the MIT PhD candidate, but against expectations, against the quiet, unspoken belief that he didn't belong here. Professor Harding was still. Nathan met her gaze. For the first time, her expression was uncertain. She looked like she was reassessing everything she thought she knew. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't scowling either. And then slowly, she gave him a nod. Nathan didn't need an apology. He didn't need validation. He had let the numbers speak for themselves. The next morning, Nathan walked into class and took his usual seat. The room felt different. Students who had barely noticed him before now watched him with curiosity, respect, maybe even a little intimidation. Brian smirked from across the aisle. "Yo, champ!" Nathan rolled his eyes, but he couldn't help but smirk. Then the door opened. Professor Harding entered, just as composed as always. She set her materials down at the front of the room, adjusting her glasses. Then she scanned the class. Her gaze landed on Nathan, and this time, there was something different in her eyes. Respect. She cleared her throat. "Before we begin today's lecture," she said, her tone as even as ever, "I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium." The room fell quiet. Nathan Hale took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country. She continued, "That is no small achievement." A few students clapped. Brian grinned, nudging Nathan's arm. Harding turned back to the board. "And with that said," she continued, "let's begin." That was it. No over-the-top praise, no long speech. Just acknowledgement. And somehow that meant more than anything else. Because Nathan hadn't needed to prove himself to her. He had needed to prove something to himself. And he had. Because sometimes the best way to change people's minds isn't through words. It's through undeniable truth. The next morning, Nathan walked into the lecture hall and took his usual seat. Everything felt different. The air in the room, the way students glanced at him when they thought he wasn't looking. It was subtle, but it was there. Recognition, respect. Even the ones who hadn't paid him any attention before were watching him now, like they were reassessing who he was. Brian smirked from across the aisle. "Yo, champ!" Nathan shook his head but smirked back. Then the door opened. Professor Harding entered, moving with the same controlled precision as always. She walked to her desk, set down her materials, and adjusted her glasses. Then she looked up. Her gaze swept the room, but when it landed on Nathan, she paused. For the first time, there was no irritation in her eyes, no dismissiveness, just something different. Respect. She cleared her throat. "Before we begin today's lecture," she said, her voice steady, "I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium." The room fell silent. Nathan Hale took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country. She continued, "That is no small achievement." A few students clapped. Brian nudged Nathan's arm, grinning. "Didn't think she'd actually say it out loud," he whispered. Harding turned back to the board. "And with that said, let's begin." That was it. No long speech, no dramatic moment, just acknowledgement. And somehow that meant more than anything else. Because Nathan hadn't needed to prove himself to her. He had needed to prove something to himself. And he had. As Harding started writing on the board, Nathan settled into his seat, his pen tapping lightly against his notebook. The equations on the board blurred slightly in his vision, his mind still lingering on everything that had led him to this moment. The challenge, the pressure, the expectations, and the undeniable truth he had carved into that stage. Numbers didn't lie. Neither did results. Harding knew it. Everyone in that room knew it. Nathan exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. And just like that, the class continued, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Nathan had nothing left to prove, not to his classmates, not to Harding, and definitely not to himself. Because in the end, the best way to challenge expectations isn't through words, it's through results. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves a great underdog moment, and subscribe for more inspiring content. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated? How did you prove them wrong?